Wyoming Territory, January 1879. The kind of cold that doesn't just touch you, it gets inside. Finds the places where you've been broken before the old fractures the healed over wounds and settles there patient and permanent like it always meant to stay. Cole Raines had been riding in that cold for 3 hours. His mare Duchess had broken through the east fence sometime before midnight. A loose post rotten at the base, the kind of thing a man notices and tells himself he'll fix tomorrow. And then tomorrow becomes a week, becomes a month, becomes the night a blizzard rolls in off the Laramie Range, and the horse he's had for 11 years decides she's done waiting on him. He tracked her by instinct more than sight. The snow was falling sideways, thick and mean, the kind that fills in a trail before you finish looking at it. Cole rode with his hat pulled low and his collar turned up, and his gloved hands loose on the reins, trusting Roper, his buckskin gelding, more than he trusted his own eyes. He was thinking about wood. The north wall of the barn needed 2 new boards before spring, and the hinge on the smokehouse door had been pulling loose since October. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the way it always was, he was thinking about the list of things that needed doing and the single pair of hands available to do them. That was the life Cole Raines had built for himself on Crescent Ridge. Practical, quiet, organized around the management of problems that had solutions because those were the only kind of problems he allowed anymore. He heard it between one gust of wind and the next. Not one sound. 3. Thin, high, fraying at the edges. The sounds of something alive that was running out of time to stay that way. Cole pulled Roper to a stop. The wind came again and took the sounds with it. He sat perfectly still in the saddle ice, cracking in his beard, and waited. A man who spent 16 years alone on a ridge learned how to wait. There, again. He turned Roper east and rode toward the fence line. The posts appeared out of the white dark one at a time. Black shapes materializing and dissolving like the storm was conjuring and erasing them. Cole almost missed her. His eye caught the shape wrong at first, read it as a fence post thicker than the others, and then Roper shied sideways, and Cole looked directly at it and understood what he was seeing. He was off the horse before he had made the decision to dismount. She was tied to the second post from the corner. Both wrists separate strands of wire pulled back around the wood, so her arms formed a wide angle behind her. She was wearing a cotton nightgown, no coat, no boots. And the snow had built up against her legs the way it builds against stationary things, patient and indifferent. Her head was down. Her dark hair was frozen in clumps against her cheeks. At her feet, wrapped in dish towels, 3 infants lay in the snow. Not crying now. Still. Cole dropped to his knees beside the closest one and pressed 2 fingers to the side of its throat. A pulse, faint as a whisper but present. He moved to the second. The third, all 3, still alive. He stood and pulled his knife. The wire was heavy gauge, the kind used to hold cattle, and it had been looped twice around each wrist and twisted tight. Not the work of a moment, not the work of a man acting without thought. The knots were deliberate. The placement was deliberate. Cole understood this immediately, in the way that a man who once spent years studying the difference between accidents and intentions understands things quietly and with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. He cut the first strand. The sound it made snapping was like a gunshot in the muffled dark. The woman's head came up. Her eyes were the color of creek water in October gray-green and very still, and they found his face with a focus that surprised him given how close to gone she looked. She said, "Not me." Her voice came out broken, barely there, the sound of something that had been used up entirely. "Not me," she said again. "Please, just them." "Quiet," Cole said. He cut the second strand. She fell forward, and he caught her with one arm. Her weight, almost nothing less than a saddle, less than a bale of hay, and he thought with a particular kind of fury he had not felt in a long time about what it meant that a grown woman weighed this little. "My babies," she said against his shoulder. "I have them. Hold on to me." He lowered her to the snow and turned to the infants. They were not moving, not making sound. He opened his coat and his jacket beneath it and pressed the first one against his chest, felt the cold of that small body burn against his skin like a brand. Then the second, then the third. He wrapped his coat around all of them and turned back to the woman. "Can you stand?" "I don't think so." "Try anyway." She tried. Her legs buckled immediately, knees going sideways in the snow, and Cole got his arm under her before she went down. "Grab the stirrup," he said. "Don't think about it, just grab it." Her fingers slipped twice on the frozen leather. The third time they held. Cole got her into the saddle with one arm and swung up behind her. One hand pressed flat over the infants tucked inside his coat, the other holding the reins, and he turned Roper north toward Crescent Ridge without saying another word. She was shaking so hard he could feel her teeth chattering through the back of her skull against his collarbone. "He said God would provide," she whispered. Cole said nothing. He said if God wanted us alive, God would save us. He said it was God's will either way. Who said that? A pause long enough that he thought maybe she had lost consciousness. Then, "My husband." The word landed between them and sat there in the dark and the cold and the sound of Roper's hooves moving through snow. "He is the preacher's son," she said. "Everyone thinks he is a righteous man." Cole kept his eyes on the dark ahead. Roper knew the way back better than he did. The wind was dropping slightly the way it sometimes did in the deepest part of the night, and Cole could hear the infants against his chest, small sounds, the sounds of things that intended to live despite everything arranged against them. "What are their names?" he asked. A long silence. "He would not let me name them," she finally said, and her voice broke on the last word. A clean break, the sound of something that had been held together by will alone, finally giving way. "He said there was no point naming things that would not last." Cole's jaw tightened until he felt it in his back teeth. "What would you have named them?" he asked. She did not answer. Not then. But she stopped shaking quite so hard, and he thought maybe the question had given her something to think about, other than dying, which was what he had intended. The cabin appeared through the trees the way it always did at the end of a hard night, suddenly and without ceremony. 4 log walls and a chimney with smoke still curling from the banked fire inside. Cole had never been so glad to see it in 16 years of coming home to it alone. He got her off the horse and through the door in one motion that was more controlled falling than anything else, and he laid her down by the hearth and turned immediately to the infants. He had done this before. 16 years ago, in a different cabin in a different storm with different hands, he had pressed a cold and silent infant against his chest and breathed warm air over her face and rubbed her skin until the color started coming back. His daughter. May's daughter. The girl they had called Rose before they knew her long enough to know if the name suited her. Rose had lived for 3 days. The fever had taken her on the 4th morning, and May had stood at that small grave in the frozen ground, and something had gone out of her that never came back. And 7 months later, he had stood at a second grave and understood that some losses hollowed a person out from the inside quiet and thorough until there was nothing left to hold the shape. He did not think about that now. He built the fire up fast, split kindling, got the flames going in under a minute from habit and muscle memory. He made a nest of blankets near the hearth and laid the 3 infants in the center and covered them with his body and breathed. His hands moved the way they had moved that first time 16 years ago, rubbing warmth back into skin that had forgotten it. The smallest one moved. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. A sound came out, not much of one but real, insistent, the sound of something that knew what it needed and was prepared to demand it. Cole sat back on his heels and allowed himself one full breath of relief. Behind him, the woman made a sound. "They are alive," she said. Her voice had gone different, stripped down to something raw and wondering. "Are they actually alive?" "All 3. They are going to be loud about it in a minute." She made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had started from a less broken place. She tried to push herself upright and could not manage it. Cole crossed to her and examined her wrists in the firelight. The wounds were deep. Not just the wire cuts, which were bad enough, ragged channels in the skin, the kind that would scar permanently. Beneath those older marks, the kind that came from repeated pressure in the same places over a long period of time. The kind that accumulated. He had seen marks like those before in a different life, when his job had been to notice things and write down what he noticed. He did not write anything down anymore, but he noticed. He always noticed. "This is going to hurt," he said. She said, "It already hurts." He cleaned the wounds with whiskey from the bottle in the cabinet and wrapped them in clean cloth. Her feet were worse than her wrists. Frostbite had taken the toes to a blackened edge, the skin splitting in two places. He packed them in cool water, not cold, warming slowly, the way a man who knows about frostbite knows you warm things gradually, because the damage comes not in the freezing, but in the too fast return of blood. She did not make a sound through any of it. When he had finished, one of the infants began to cry. Not thin and faint anymore. Properly. Furiously. The other two joined in within seconds, three voices braiding together into something that filled every corner of a cabin that had been silent for a very long time. The woman's entire face changed. She reached for them, and Cole brought them to her one at a time, and she gathered them against her chest with the particular desperation of a person holding something they came very close to losing forever. "I need to name them," she said. "Name them then." She looked at the first one, the smallest, the one who had moved first, the fighter, Nora. She touched the baby's cheek with one bandaged hand, gentle as anything Cole had ever witnessed. "For the month, we were supposed to start over." She looked at the second. "Bess, after my grandmother. She would have stood up for me if she had been alive to do it." The third. "Willa." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "Because she is strong. Because I want her to know she is strong. Because I want all of them to know that." She stopped. Then she added very quietly, "Because I want to know it too." Cole moved to his workbench without a word. He found 3 pieces of cedar he had been storing since fall, the good straight-grained kind, and he picked up his carving knife and started working. The letters came out clean and even. He had had practice once a long time ago with a different set of letters and a different kind of grief driving the knife. He hung the 3 small plaques on the mantel above the fire. Nora. Bess. Willa. The woman stared at them for a long time. Then she looked at him. "What is your name?" "Cole Rains." "I am Wren. Wren Alcott." She paused. "Wren Voss legally, but Alcott was my name first." "Then it is still your name," Cole said. She looked at him. Something shifted in her face, some small incremental thing, the way ice shifts on a river in the first week of March, barely visible but carrying enormous consequence beneath it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You do not know me. We are nothing to you." Cole looked at the 3 plaques on the mantel. 3 names that meant these 3 children had been seen and had been counted, had been given the kind of weight that names give things. "You needed help," he said. "I was there." He turned back to his workbench and left it at that, because it was the truest thing he could say. And he had learned over 16 years of solitude that true things did not generally require elaboration. She was asleep by the time the sky outside began to lighten, all 3 infants tucked against her. The 4 of them breathing in the same slow rhythm near the warmth of the fire. Cole sat across the room and watched the dawn come through the east window and thought about what he had found out on that fence line. He thought about it the way he had trained himself to think about difficult things, methodically following one fact to the next, without letting feeling get ahead of evidence. He thought about the knots careful and deliberate tied from behind, which meant the person tying them was standing behind the woman, which meant she was already secured at the post before the second wrist was done, which meant she could not have fought back effectively, which meant the whole thing had been arranged before it began. He thought about the timing. After the birth, when she would be at her absolute weakest, when her body had spent everything it had on 3 lives at once. He thought about the wire. Heavy gauge. Not something you happen to have in your hand. He thought about the words she had told him. The husband's words. Spoken as scripture. spoken as verdict and sentence and execution all at once. Cole Raines had spent years of his life learning how men like that thought, how they constructed their righteousness, how they maintained it, how they used it as cover for the things they did in private. He had studied them the way a man studies something dangerous, with his full attention and without illusions. He had stopped doing that kind of work 16 years ago. He had moved to Crescent Ridge and built 4 walls and a daily routine, and told himself that was wisdom, that a man who had lost everything to caring too much about things he could not ultimately control had earned the right to stop caring. He looked at Wren Alcott sleeping by his fire. He looked at Nora, Bess, Willa, on the mantel. The question came back that had been circling since the moment he heard 3 cries in a blizzard and turned his horse east toward them instead of continuing north toward home. What kind of man rides past? Not the answer. Just the question sitting there in the early light, waiting for him to decide what to do with it. He was still sitting with it when the hoofbeats came. Single horse. Fast, given the snow fast enough that whoever it was knew the trail well and was not wasting time on caution. Cole had his rifle in his hands, and the door opened before the rider cleared the tree line. He lowered the gun when he saw who it was. Ada Briggs. 68 years old, wrapped in so many layers, she looked nearly twice her considerable width, her gray horse steaming and blowing in the cold morning air. She had the expression of a woman who had ridden hard and had news that justified the effort. "Put that thing down, Cole Raines," she said, pulling up at the gate. "I am not here to cause trouble. I am here because there is plenty of it coming your way, and you need to know about it before it arrives." Cole stepped aside and let her through. Ada Briggs had lived in the valley below Crescent Ridge for 40 years longer than Cole had been in the territory. She had buried 2 husbands and raised 5 children and delivered half the babies born in a 30-mile radius. And she possessed a quality that Cole had rarely seen in anyone else, the ability to walk into a room and immediately and accurately understand the full weight of everything happening in it. She looked at Wren, sleeping by the fire. She looked at the 3 infants. She looked at the bandaged wrists and the cedar plaques on the mantel and the whiskey bottle Cole had used to clean the wounds. She did not say anything for a moment, and in that moment, something moved through her face that was private and painful, and she put it away with the efficiency of a woman who had learned not to let feeling interfere with what needed doing. Then she looked at Cole. "Harlan Voss went to Judge Perrin last night," she said, "before the snow stopped. Filed a sworn statement saying Wren suffered a mental collapse after the birth, that she became violent, that she tried to harm the infants herself, and that he barely managed to remove the children from her before she ran out into the storm." Cole said nothing. "He has a temporary guardianship order for the 3 babies, signed by Perrin, effective immediately upon location of the infants." "Perrin," Cole said. "Edgar Voss built the judge's house," Ada said. "Funded his last 2 elections. Pays the salary of every man on Perrin's administrative staff." She looked at the sleeping babies with an expression that contained a great deal that she was keeping carefully controlled. "That order is legal, Cole. Under current territorial statute, it is a valid legal document." Wren was awake. Cole did not know when she had surfaced from sleep, but she was watching Ada from the floor with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is the safest initial response to information that might undo you. "He told them I was mad," she said. Not a question. She had already calculated the most likely shape of Harlan's story and arrived at it without needing to be told. "He told them what serves him best," Ada said with the direct, unsentimental bluntness of a woman who had spent the better part of 7 decades watching people do what served them and had stopped being surprised by it, though she had never stopped being angry. Which is what men like Harlan Voss always do. "He will come for them," Wren said. "Yes. He will come here. Yes, with men, most likely. His father has resources enough to hire them." A silence settled over the cabin. The fire crackled. One of the infants made a small sound and resettled against her mother's side. Cole had been standing in the doorway through this exchange, the cold at his back and the warmth of the fire at his front. He was thinking about the knots again. The deliberate, careful, premeditated knots. He was thinking about a man who rode to a judge's office before the snow stopped, who filed legal paperwork while his wife was still secured to a fence post in 14-degree weather. That was not impulse. That was not a man who lost his temper and did something terrible and then panicked and made poor decisions in the aftermath. That was a plan executed in sequence with the legal component filed before anyone could ask inconvenient questions about the physical evidence. "What do you know about Harlan Voss?" Cole asked Ada. "Beyond what the town says about him." She looked at him. Something moved behind her eyes, a decision being made about how much to say and what it would cost her to say it. "I know things I should have said sooner," she said quietly. "Things I kept quiet because Edgar Voss owns more of this county than God does, and I am an old woman who lives alone, and some kinds of truth carry a price that is easier to let someone else pay." She looked at the fire. "I am done doing that calculation?" Cole waited. "Before Ren Harlan had another wife," Ada said. "A young woman from Abilene. Cora Dillard, she was called before she married him. I knew her people from Abilene. Good family, quiet girl." Ada's voice went careful. "She came to Redemption Falls in the spring of 1876, married Harlan in June, and was dead the following May. 11 months. The room was very quiet. They said it was fever. Dr. Halsey signed the papers. Dr. Halsey, who has not once in 30 years declined to sign anything that Edgar Voss needed signed. Ada looked at Ren directly. "I was there the week before Cora died. I had come to bring a remedy for a cough. She had bruises on her arms, old ones and new ones together. She said she had fallen. She said it twice the second time before I asked." Ada stopped. "I did not push. I told myself I did not know enough to say anything. I told myself that kind of thing was between a man and his wife. I have told myself those things every day for 3 years. She looked at Cole. "I am done telling myself those things?" Cole set his rifle against the wall beside the door. He walked to the window and looked out at the white ridge and the white sky and the snow-buried world below him, the valley where Redemption Falls sat and went about its business of believing what it had been arranged to believe. He thought about May. He thought about the way she had looked the last morning he had seen her alive, standing in the doorway of their place in Copper Creek, one hand raised as he rode out her face in the early light. He thought about riding back 4 days early because something had felt wrong, something he could not name or locate, only feel the way an animal feels a change in weather before any instrument records it. He thought about the smoke he had seen from 3 miles out. He thought about what was left when he got there. And he thought about the name that had been at the center of the file he had been building in the 2 years before they pulled him off the job and took his badge and his records and told him to be grateful they were not pressing charges. Edgar Voss. That name was now in the form of a son and a signed guardianship order and a judge who could be purchased like a piece of property reaching up the ridge toward 3 infants sleeping by his fire. Cole turned away from the window. "They are not taking those children," he said. Ada looked at him with the sharpness of a woman reading what was beneath the words, not just the statement itself, but the 16 years pressing behind it like water behind a dam. "Cole," she said with a care in her voice that she did not usually employ. "Whatever comes next, whatever he brings up that road." Cole looked at Ren. "Those children stay where they are, and so does she." Ren Alcott, 23 years old, sitting on the floor of a stranger's cabin with bandaged wrists and 3 sleeping infants in her lap, and the full weight of what was coming bearing down on her from the valley below, looked at Cole Raines and did not look away. Outside, the blizzard was finally ending. The wind had dropped. The snow was settling into the new silence that follows storms, that particular hush that makes the world look clean and manageable, which it generally is not. Cole pulled on his coat. "I will take care of the horses," he said. "When those girls wake up hungry, there is goat's milk in the cold box. Warm it slowly. Use the spoon on the shelf, the thin one on the high shelf." He picked up his hat. "The thin one," he said again, and went out. Ren looked at the spoon he meant. It sat on the highest shelf, set apart from the others, worn smooth and thin in the way that objects get worn when they have been used with great care over a long period of time by hands that meant something by the using. She reached up and took it down carefully. It was old. The handle had been carved, not bought, and the wood had the particular warmth that old wood gets from many hands and many years. Someone had made this for a specific purpose with specific attention and had kept it long after that purpose had passed. Somewhere outside she heard Cole Raines talking quietly to his horse in the barn. Just a low, steady murmur, the sound of a man who had spent 16 years in the company mostly of animals and had made his peace with that arrangement, but perhaps she thought had not entirely stopped wondering if something different was possible. Nora stirred against her chest. Then Bess, then Willa. 3 small faces wrinkling toward hunger in almost perfect sequence, and Wren Alcott began carefully and with hands that still hurt and would for some time to warm the milk. On the mantel above her in the firelight, 3 cedar plaques said 3 names. Nora, Bess, Willa. Below in the valley, a man who called himself righteous was making plans. And on Crescent Ridge, a cowboy stood in a cold barn in the silence after a blizzard and made himself a promise he had been a long time arriving at. Not this time. He came on a Tuesday, 7 days after Cole had cut Wren Alcott down from that fence. 7 days after 3 infants had been warmed back to life in a stranger's cabin on Crescent Ridge. Harlan Voss rode up the trail with 6 men behind him and the expression of a man who believed the world had been personally arranged to receive him well. Cole was splitting wood when he heard them. He set the axe down against the chopping block with the unhurried precision of a man who does not want his hands occupied when company of this kind arrives, and walked to the gate. He got there before they reached it and stood with his hands loose at his sides and waited. Harlan Voss was 31 years old and looked like what he was, a man who had grown up with enough money to avoid the kind of work that puts permanent marks on a person. His coat was good wool, dark and clean. His hat showed no weather. He sat his horse the way men sit horses when they have always had good horses to sit comfortably and without thinking about it. His face was the kind of face that got called handsome in church and got believed in courtrooms, all clean angles, and practiced sincerity arranged into an expression of patient concern. He pulled up 10 feet from Cole and looked down from the saddle. "Mr. Raines," he said. His voice was a preacher's voice, modulated and warm, the kind that filled rooms without appearing to try. "I do not believe we have met formally. I am Harlan Voss. I believe you may have my wife and children." "I do not have anything of yours," Cole said. Harlan smiled. It was a good smile. Practiced, smooth, deployed with precision. "I understand there may be some confusion about what happened," he said. "Wren has been unwell. The birth was difficult, 3 children at once, and the strain affected her mind. It is not uncommon. The doctors have a name for it now. She needed to be restrained for her own safety and the safety of the infants until proper help could arrive." He spread his hands, a gesture of reasonable helplessness designed to invite sympathy. "I never imagined she would manage to get herself loose in that condition. I have been sick with worry." Cole looked at him for a long moment. He had the ability developed over years of interviewing people who were not telling the truth to look at a person without expression for longer than was comfortable and simply wait for them to continue filling the silence. "She did not get herself loose," he said. "I cut her loose, with a knife, because the wire had gone through to bone on both wrists and she had not felt her hands in hours." Something moved behind Harlan's eyes, small and fast there and gone. "The wire was to keep her from hurting herself," he said, "or the children." "The knots were tied from behind," Cole said. Her arms pulled back around the post at an angle that made self-application physically impossible. "I know what restraint looks like, and I know what punishment looks like." He said each clause separately, giving each one room to be understood. "Those were punishment knots." Silence. One of the 6 men behind Harlan shifted in his saddle. The creak of leather was very loud in the cold morning air. Harlan's smile had gone somewhere. What was left on his face was quieter and more honest and considerably less pleasant to look at. "I have a legal document," he said, "signed by Judge Perrin. granting me temporary guardianship of my children pending a formal hearing. I know about the document. Then you know I have every legal right to take my children home. What I know, Cole said, is that Judge Perrin's operational budget traces back to Edgar Voss Enterprises and has for 11 years. What I know is that a signed document from a purchased judge is worth the price of the transaction and nothing beyond it. He held Harlan's gaze steadily. And what I know is that you came up here with 6 men to collect a woman and 3 infants who are 1 week old, which tells me a considerable amount about how confident you actually are in that document. Harlan Voss stared at him. Then he looked past Cole toward the cabin. The door was closed. The curtains were drawn, but smoke was rising from the chimney, thick and steady. The smoke of a well-fed fire, the smoke of a place where people were warm and intended to remain that way. He looked back at Cole. The pleasantness was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was not rage exactly. It was colder than rage, more deliberate. The expression of a man recalculating. "You're making an enemy you cannot afford," he said quietly. "I have had worse," Cole said. "My father owns most of this county." "I know what your father owns." Something in the way Cole said it, the specific weight on the word knows, made Harlan go still. A flicker of something not quite uncertainty, but adjacent to it, moved across his face and was suppressed quickly. "This is not finished," Harlan said. "No," Cole agreed. "It is not." Harlan pulled his horse around. The 6 men followed. Cole stood at the gate and watched them ride back down the trail until the trees swallowed them. And then he stood there a moment longer, listening to the silence they left behind, reading it the way he had once been trained to read situations for what was not being said. Then he turned and went back to the woodpile and picked up the axe and finished splitting the wood, because the wood still needed splitting, and the doing of necessary things was how a man kept himself level when his blood was running hot. Inside the cabin, Wren was at the window with the curtain pulled back, watching the trail. All 3 infants were in the blanket nest by the fire. Nora was awake watching the ceiling with the focused intensity she had been showing since her 2nd day of life, working out some problem that the rest of them had not yet identified. "He is gone," Cole said. "For now," Wren said. She did not move from the window. "For now," he agreed. She turned. Her face was doing several things at once that she was not entirely managing to keep separate. Cole understood that she was afraid in the specific way that people are afraid when they have been afraid for so long that the fear has become structural, has become load-bearing, has become part of how they understand the world to function. "He will not stop," she said. "I need you to understand that about him. He does not lose. He has never lost anything in his life that his father's money did not recover for him, and he does not know how to conceive of a situation where that changes." "I understand that about him," Cole said. "He will come back with more men. A different judge or the same judge with a different document. He will bring a doctor who will testify that I'm insane. He has people who will say whatever he needs them to say." She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. "He will find a way to make this legal." "Then we find a way to make the truth louder than legal," Cole said. He hung his coat and went to the stove. There was coffee from that morning, still warm enough to serve, and he poured 2 cups and set one on the table near where Wren was standing and sat down himself with the other. After a moment, she came and sat across from him. "Ada told me about the woman before you," Cole said. "Cora Dillard, before she was Cora Voss." Wren was quiet for a moment. "He talked about her sometimes," she said finally. "Always as a tragedy. Always as something that had happened to him, how God had tested him through her loss, how he had persevered in his grief with his faith intact." She looked at her coffee cup. "I believed it. When we met, when he courted me, I thought he was the most genuinely good man I had ever encountered. I thought he had suffered and come through it, and that was something rare and worth trusting." "When did you understand differently?" 3 months after we married." She said it flat and clean, the way people say things they have had a long time to practice saying. "The first time. Over something I burned on the stove. Something I said that he took wrong. I do not remember which it was anymore." She looked at the surface of her coffee cup. He apologized after, brought flowers the following day, said it would never happen again, and I believed that too. But it did happen again. Of course it did. And then again. And then it was simply part of what my life was, and I stopped expecting anything different, and I stopped imagining what different might look like. When I became pregnant, I thought perhaps that would change things. He wanted sons. He talked about sons constantly, the legacy he would build with them, what they would inherit, what they would become. She stopped. When the midwife told him all three were girls, he did not say anything. He just looked at them, and then he looked at me. She paused. He looked at them the way you look at something that has failed its purpose, she said. And I knew. The fire settled. Bess made a small sound and subsided. I am going to write a letter, Cole said, to a man named Holt Crawford. He is a federal marshal stationed out of Cheyenne. I knew him years ago in a different version of my life. If he is still the man I knew, he will listen. He held his coffee cup in both hands. What is happening here is bigger than one woman and 3 babies. Crawford needs to know the shape of the larger thing. Wren looked at him. You think a federal marshal will come up to this ridge on behalf of people like us? I think what is happening here connects to things that have been happening in this county for a long time, Cole said. And I think when Crawford sees the evidence of that, he will understand the full scope of what he is being asked to look at. He did not say more than that yet. There were things still assembling themselves in his mind into a shape he could speak, and he had learned at considerable cost the price of speaking before a thing was fully formed. That night, after Wren and the girls were asleep, Cole sat at his workbench by lamplight and opened the tin box he kept under the loose board in the corner of the bedroom. He had not opened it in 3 years. He had opened it perhaps 6 times in 16 years. Each time he had looked at what was inside and closed it again and returned it to its place under the board, because there had been nothing to do with its contents except keep them, and he had kept them the way a man keeps certain things, not knowing exactly why, only knowing that throwing them away was not possible. The file was still there, organized exactly as he had left it, 2 years of work from a previous life compressed into papers that was 16 years old. Now, the ink slightly faded at the margins, but the facts still precise, still following one from the next in the careful sequence he had built before they had taken all of it away. He read through it slowly. Land fraud, coercion, property transfers that did not reflect the actual negotiations that preceded them. 3 homesteads burned in the spring of 1863, all belonging to families who had refused to sell. Among the notations in the margin of the 3rd page in his own handwriting from 16 years ago, 3 structures burned, 2 families unaccounted for, possible homicide. Investigate. He had not been given the opportunity to investigate. He turned to the 4th page and found what he was looking for. A property transaction dated September 1874, more than a decade after his original investigation had been shut down. A transfer of 60 acres from a homestead registered to one Thomas Burrell to Edgar Voss Enterprises. Beside the transaction in ink that was newer than the surrounding pages added by Cole, sometime in the years after his forced departure, when pieces of information continued to reach him through channels that had no reason to stop simply because he had been removed from his official position, he had written 3 words. Wife. Agnes. Unaccounted. He sat with that for a long moment. Agnes Burrell. A name he had written down once and kept without knowing precisely what it meant, the way you keep things when your instinct tells you they matter, but the evidence has not yet arranged itself into a provable shape. He had never known what happened to Agnes Burrell. He had kept the notation because the pattern it suggested was consistent with everything else he had documented about Edgar Voss. The pattern of a man who removed obstacles and the people attached to obstacles with systematic efficiency and the protection of purchased authority. Now Crawford was going to look for Agnes Burrell, too. Now her name was going to mean something in a room with proper legal standing. It had taken 16 years and a woman tied to a fence post in January to get him to this moment. He put the file on the workbench beside the blank pages he was going to fill with Crawford's letter, and he began to write. 3 pages close and careful, laying out what he had found and what he knew, and what he could demonstrate from the file. At the end of the 3rd page, he wrote one more paragraph that took him longer than the rest of it combined, because it required him to open a door he had kept sealed for 16 years, the door between what had happened to May. And the name that Cole had never been able to prove was responsible for it, the name that was now doing through a son what it had always done. He finished the letter before midnight and sealed it and set it by the door. Then he sat at the workbench for a while longer in the quiet of the cabin and thought about what he had just done. He had spent 16 years on this ridge telling himself that the isolation was wisdom, that a man who had lost what he had lost to caring too deeply about things he could not ultimately control had earned the right to stop, that the cold and the work and the silence were sufficient, were what remained possible, were what he deserved. He looked at the door to the main room where Wren and the girls slept. He thought about what Wren had said about not knowing what different looked like, about having stopped imagining it. He understood that from the inside. In the morning, Cole rode down to Redemption Falls and posted the letter. He bought supplies with the efficient minimum of conversation that had been his practice in town for years, and he heard in the silences around his transactions and the too careful manner of people who had made up their minds about a situation what the town was thinking. The town had its story. It had organized the available facts into the shape that caused the least disruption to the existing arrangement of things. The story was that Wren Voss had lost her mind. The story was that Cole Raines, the solitary figure on the ridge who had not come down to town in 2 years, had taken advantage of a vulnerable woman and was keeping her and Harlan's children in a manner contrary to law and to decency. The story was that Harlan Voss was a wronged and patient man doing everything available to him to recover his family. Edgar Voss's money moved through a town the way water moved through soil. You could not always see it directly, but everything it touched took the shape it required. Cole bought his supplies and rode back up the ridge. 3 weeks after Harlan's first visit, Nora got sick. It came on fast, the way fever comes on in very young children, without warning or gradual approach, simply present and severe when it had not been there an hour before. Cole woke at 3 in the morning to a cry that was different from the usual cries, thinner and more urgent, carrying the particular quality that he recognized from the deepest place in his memory before he was fully conscious of what he was hearing. He was across the cabin before he was fully awake. Nora was burning. He could feel the heat of her from an inch away before he touched her, and when he pressed his palm to her forehead, he closed his eyes for a moment against the temperature he found there. Wren was already awake, already holding her, her face gone white and very still. "How long?" Cole asked. "I do not know. I woke up and she was like this." He took Nora carefully from Wren's arms. The infant was limp in the specific way that meant the body was spending every resource it had on an internal battle and had nothing remaining for ordinary responsiveness. Her breathing was fast and shallow. Her color was wrong in the firelight. Cole had seen this before. He moved to the hearth and built the fire up and sat down with Nora against his chest, her burning forehead against his neck, and began to talk to her in the low murmur he used for animals in distress. Wordless and rhythmic, just sound and warmth and presence. The communication that exists beneath language. Wren sat across from him. She did not speak. She watched his hands on her daughter with an expression that Cole did not examine directly because it contained things that were too large and too complicated for the middle of the night, when there were only practical things to focus on. He sent Wren for the cool water and the cloths, and they traded off through the hours, sponging Nora down when the heat climbed, warming her when she shivered, keeping her against skin, keeping the sound going. The other two slept on undisturbed, which said something about their constitutions or their trust or both. Somewhere in the darkest part of the night, Cole heard himself say a name. He caught it after the first syllable and pulled it back. But Wren had heard enough. She did not say anything immediately. The fire had burned down to coals, and the cabin was dim and close, and Nora had gone into a restless half-sleep that was better than what she had been doing 2 hours ago. "Rose," Wren said quietly. Not a question. Cole looked at the coals. "My daughter," he said. She was 3 days old. Fever took her on the 4th morning. He adjusted Nora against his chest. I did everything I am doing now. Everything I knew. It was not enough that time. Wren was quiet. What was her mother's name? May. The name came out the way it always did when he said it, which was rarely clean and with a specific weight. May Rains. She was 24 years old. What happened to her? Cole looked at the coals for a while. The question deserved an honest answer, and he was deciding how complete to make it. Some truths needed to be said in full, and some needed to be said in parts, and the difference was not always obvious until you were already saying them. She died 7 months after Rose, he said. Some losses take people that way. They go in deep and they do not surface again. He paused. That is the part I tell people. The rest of what happened I have mostly kept to myself. Wren did not push. That was one of the things he had come to notice about her. In 3 weeks of close proximity, she understood instinctively where the edges of things were and did not step over them before she was invited. It was the understanding of a person who had learned over time that uninvited crossings had consequences. He did not like what that told him about how she had come by that understanding. The letter I wrote to Crawford, Cole said. There are things in it I have not told you yet. You do not have to tell me. I know I do not have to. He looked at her across the dim room. But you are the one who will be standing in front of a courtroom when this reaches its conclusion. You should know what you are standing in the middle of. Wren waited. 16 years ago, I was working a case, Cole said. Land fraud to start with. A man buying up territory in this county, pressuring the people who would not sell, and when pressure did not work, finding other methods. 3 homesteads burned in the spring of 1863. The families who refused. He looked at Nora, sleeping against his chest. 1 family got out in time. 2 did not. The fire ticked softly in the settling coals. May was at our place in Copper Creek while I was following a lead 40 miles east, Cole said. The file I was building had our address in it. Someone wanted to make certain I understood what came of looking too hard at particular names. He felt Wren go very still across from him. I could not prove the fire was set deliberately, he said. Not with what remained afterward. 2 weeks later, I was called in. My credentials were revoked, my files were confiscated, and I was told the case was closed, and that pursuing it privately would result in legal consequences I would not enjoy. He shifted Nora against him. So I came up here, built the cabin, raised cattle, told myself it was wisdom. It was not wisdom, Wren said. No, Cole said. It was grief wearing wisdom's clothing. There is a difference, but it took me a long time to see it clearly. Wren was quiet for a moment. The name at the top of the file, she said. Was it Edgar Voss? Yes. The word sat between them with everything it meant. Then this has been coming for 16 years, she said. It has been waiting for 16 years, Cole said. That is different from coming. It needed a reason to move. He looked at the 3 cedar plaques on the mantel just visible in the low light. Nora, Bess, Willa. It has one now, he said. Nora's breathing had changed. Cole pressed close and listened, and then sat back. Fever is breaking, he said. Wren let out a breath that had been held, it seemed for hours. They stayed where they were, as the sky outside began to lighten, neither speaking nor sleeping against Cole's chest with the deep total sleep of a body that has spent everything it had on a fight and come through it. At some point in the way that small things happen in the quiet, after a long, difficult night, Wren reached out and placed her hand briefly over Cole's where it rested on Nora's back. She did not say anything. He did not either. But it meant something, and they both understood what it meant, and neither of them was quite prepared to look at it directly yet, so they left it where it was and let the morning come. By full daylight, Nora was fussing for milk. Cole had never been so glad to hear a complaint. Several days later, Ada Briggs came up the ridge again with eggs and cloth and the particular expression she wore when she was carrying news that would require sitting down to receive properly. "Harlan has filed with the territorial court in Cheyenne," she said, settling at Cole's table, "for a formal hearing. His lawyer is a man named Pratt, comes down from Denver, costs more per day than most families in this valley see in a month." Cole poured her coffee. "The hearing is in 6 weeks, Ada said. "Right here in Redemption Falls. Judge Perrin presiding." "Perrin cannot preside over a federal matter," Cole said. "It is not being brought as federal, it is being brought as domestic. Guardianship competency, marital law. On those grounds, Perrin has full jurisdiction." Ada looked at him steadily. "Wren will have to testify, in open court, in front of this town." Wren, who had been listening from across the room with Bess in her arms, said, "All right." Both Cole and Ada looked at her. "I said all right," she repeated. Her voice was quiet, but it carried something that had not been in it 3 weeks ago. A density, a solidity. The sound of something that had found its footing and was standing on it. "I will stand up in that courtroom and I will tell them the truth. All of it. Every day of it. Every bruise. Every word he used to explain to me why he deserved what was happening." She looked at Bess in her arms. "He called these girls nothing. He said they were not worth naming. I will stand in front of this entire town and I will tell them what their righteous preacher's son does behind closed doors, and I will not stop until they have heard everything." The fire crackled. Ada looked at her for a long moment, and then she looked at Cole, and in her expression was something that a woman of her age and experience permitted herself only rarely a tentative, careful, qualified hope. "Well," she said. "Good." She set down her coffee cup. "There is one more thing," she said. "Ruth Calloway." "The widow in Miller Creek," Cole said. "She was a midwife for 30 years before her hands gave out. She attended Cora Voss in the weeks before Cora died. She has never talked about what she saw." Ada paused. "I think she has been afraid. I think she might need to be asked by the right person in the right way." Cole looked at Ada. "Can you talk to her?" Ada considered this. "I can try. She knows me." She picked up her coffee again. "I will not make promises about what she will agree to. Some people carry a silence too long, and it becomes part of them, and they cannot give it up, even when they want to." 3 days later, Ada rode down to Miller Creek. She was gone most of the afternoon. When she came back up the ridge, she came alone and said little. She poured herself coffee and sat at Cole's table and looked at the fire for a while in a way that meant she was organizing what she had to report. "Ruth Calloway," she said finally, "has been carrying a small brown book for 3 years." Cole waited. "She asked me one question," Ada said. "She asked whether it would matter, whether anyone would actually listen given who the Voss family is in this county." She set down her coffee cup. "I told her I knew a man who had kept evidence for 16 years waiting for the right moment to use it. I told her this was the moment." She looked at Cole. "She will come to the hearing. She will testify to what she saw." Cole nodded once. The 6 weeks that followed were the most purposeful Cole had felt since the morning 16 years ago when he had ridden out of Copper Creek on a case and the world had been a different shape than it was when he returned. Every evening after the girls were settled, he sat across from Wren at the table and helped her find words for what she needed to say in court. Not his words. Her words, but organized, given the precision that a courtroom required, stripped of apology and hedging, and the reflexive minimization that years of being told she was wrong about her own experience had installed in her manner of speaking. She was a quick study. She had always been. She told him once, though she had spent years being told that her quickness was a liability, that it made her difficult, that a woman who thought too clearly about things was a problem waiting to happen. She said it with the particular tone people use for things they have been told so often they nearly believe them. Cole told her that the courtroom would need exactly the qualities she had been taught to suppress. She practiced. He watched her get stronger in the way that people get stronger when they start to believe that their strength is permitted, when they stop spending energy managing the performance of being smaller than they are. It was not dramatic. It was incremental. A sentence said without the apologetic qualifier at the end of it. A question asked directly without the softening preamble. A moment of standing to her full height without immediately adjusting downward. He split firewood and watched it happen and thought about May, about the particular quality May had possessed, of believing fully in people's capacity to become what they needed to be, and about how that quality had always seemed to him both her greatest gift and the thing that made her most vulnerable to a world that did not always deserve it. He thought May would have found Wren Alcott worth every bit of that belief. When the letter came back from Holt Crawford in Cheyenne, Cole read it twice and then walked out to the barn and stood with his hand on Roper's neck for a while without speaking. Crawford was coming. He had read the file Cole had summarized in the letter, had made inquiries through federal channels that he did not detail in the letter, but that had produced results he referred to as significant, and he would arrive in Redemption Falls the morning of the hearing with 2 deputies and the full standing of the federal marshal's office. He could not. He wrote carefully intervene directly in a domestic territorial proceeding. But he could be present, he could be visible, and he could bring what he was bringing in the sealed envelope he would deliver to the court directly. Cole folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket and went back inside. 6 weeks, he had told himself, it would have to be enough. Standing in his own cabin with 3 cedar plaques on the mantel and a woman practicing her testimony at his kitchen table and 3 infants sleeping in the next room, he thought for the first time in a very long time that enough might actually be possible. The morning of the hearing, Cole woke before dawn. He lay still in the dark and listened to the cabin. 3 small breathing sounds from the other room where Ada had come up the night before to stay with the girls. The low, settled tick of the fire. Wind off the Laramie Range quieter than it had been all week, as if the weather had decided to hold itself in reserve for something. He got up and dressed carefully. Good clothes, the ones kept for occasions that required a man to look like he understood their weight. Dark trousers, clean shirt. The coat from Cheyenne bought 7 years ago and worn perhaps a dozen times since. He stood at the small mirror above the wash basin and looked at himself for a moment, something he generally avoided as a practice. He saw a man who was 39 years old and carried it honestly weathered at the edges, holding something behind his eyes that no amount of sleep had ever quite resolved. He went to the corner of the bedroom, lifted the loose board, and took out the tin box. He opened it and held the file in both hands. 16 years of compressed evidence. 16 years of a promise he had made to himself standing at May's grave in the frozen ground of Copper Creek in the fall of 1863. A promise he had not known until recently what form its keeping would take. He put the file under his arm and went to make coffee. Wren was already awake. She was sitting at the table in the dress that 2 of Ada's women friends had quietly put together from the fabric that had been sent up anonymously from town. Dark blue wool, simple and well-made, the kind of dress that communicated seriousness without performance. Her hair was pinned back. The scars on her wrists were visible and would be permanently. She had her hands around a coffee cup and the expression of someone doing internal work that did not need interruption. Cole poured his coffee and sat across from her, and they drank in the early quiet, which was something they had become good at over 6 weeks sitting together in the thin morning dark without needing to fill it with words. "How are you?" he asked when the light outside had begun to shift. "Scared," she said, "and ready, both at once." "That is about right," he said. She looked at the file under his arm. She had known about it for 3 weeks, since the night he had told her about May and Edgar Voss and the 16 years that connected those 2 facts. She had not asked to look inside it, and he had not offered. Some things had a right moment, and this was it. "Will it be enough?" she asked. Cole considered this the way he considered hard questions directly, and without the comfort of false assurance. "I do not know," he said honestly. "Crawford is coming with what he has found through federal channels. What is in this file is 16 years old and evidence ages in court. Defense lawyers know that better than anyone." He looked at her. "What will not age is what you say on that stand. What you saw and what he did and what you know. That is current. That is real. That is what they cannot argue away." Wren nodded slowly. "I practiced again last night," she said, "after you went to bed. Sat up and said all of it out loud by myself in the dark." "How did it feel?" "Like something I should have done a long time ago," she said. "And like something I could not have done until right now. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I have stopped trying to work out which one matters more." Cole looked at her across the table in the early morning light and thought about 6 weeks ago. A woman who could barely stand, who whispered apologies for surviving, who had not known if she was permitted to name her own children. He thought about what it cost a person to become something different than what years of accumulated damage had shaped them to be. He thought about how much it required not just time and safety, but the repeated daily decision made in small ways until it calcified into something permanent, that the story about who you were that other people had written was not the final word on the subject. "You are ready," he said. She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "I am." They rode down to Redemption Falls in the thin January light, Cole on Roper and Wren on the bay mare. Ada had lent her the trail clear and bright with last week's snow. The valley opened up as they descended the town visible from the ridge, and even from that distance Cole could see that the morning was different down there. More horses at the posts, more people on the boardwalks. The particular density of a small community that knows something significant is about to happen in it and has turned out to observe. They rode in without hurrying. The silence that spread from them as they passed through the main street was a specific kind of silence, the kind that requires effort to maintain, the kind that represents a decision people are making about where they stand. Cole kept his eyes forward and his hands easy on the reins. Wren rode straight-backed beside him, her chin level, her face composed around whatever was moving beneath its surface. Someone on the boardwalk said something aimed at Wren ugly and pointed. Cole turned his head and looked at the man who had said it with a flat, direct, unhurried look that lasted perhaps 4 seconds. The man found something extremely interesting to study in the boards at his feet. They tied the horses and went inside. The courtroom was a converted hall above the feed store, high-ceilinged and cold. Despite the stoves at either end of the room, the windows fogged with the breath of a crowd that had filled every bench and was standing 3 deep along the walls. At the front, behind the long table that served as the judge's bench, Perrin was already seated, small and precise, his white collar very bright. At the respondent's table, Harlan Voss sat beside his Denver lawyer, a man named Pratt, who had the particular quality of expensive legal talent competence presented with such ease that it was almost impossible to see the calculation underneath it. Harlan was dressed as he always dressed, impeccably, as if for the kind of church that required it. He looked up when Cole and Wren entered, and his face showed nothing at all. He had had time to prepare his face. Edgar Voss sat in the first row of the gallery. Silver-haired, composed, the posture of a man who had moved through 70 years of life without being seriously inconvenienced by any of it. He did not look at Cole. He looked straight ahead. Cole scanned the room until he found what he was looking for. Marshal Holt Crawford and 2 deputies standing along the back wall. Crawford was a big man, gray at the temples now, with the quality of stillness that long federal work installed in a person. He met Cole's eyes across the room and gave a small single nod. Cole sat beside Wren at the petitioner's table and laid the file flat in front of him. Judge Perrin called the proceeding to order. What followed for the first hour was the grinding procedural machinery of a legal process operating in service of a conclusion that had been arranged in advance. Perrin moved efficiently, sustaining objections from Pratt before they finished being made, treating the county attorney, who was nominally present to represent the territorial interest, with the consistent mild impatience of a man who considered him decorative. Pratt called a physician, a man Cole had not seen before, who testified at length about the medical literature on puerperal insanity, its presentation, its dangers, its documented frequency. He used long words with the confidence of someone who knows that most people in a room will not challenge what they do not fully understand. He was persuasive in the way that paid expertise is persuasive. Pratt called 2 men from Redemption Falls who testified to having observed Wren in town during her pregnancy, found her erratic, not herself, concerning in ways they struggled to specify but felt confident asserting. Then Pratt called Harlan Voss. Harlan walked to the witness chair the way he walked everywhere, with the unhurried grace of a man who expected rooms to receive him well, because rooms generally had. He sat and folded his hands and looked at his lawyer with the expression of a man who had suffered considerably and was managing his suffering with admirable dignity. What came out of his mouth over the following 30 minutes was a masterwork of its particular kind. He described Wren's pregnancy as a period of escalating instability. He described her fears as irrational, her behavior as frightening. He described the night of the birth with sorrowful precision, the way she had become uncontrollable afterward, the way he had been forced to remove the infants from immediate danger, the way she had struggled against him and injured her own wrists in the process. His voice broke at one precise moment, deployed with perfect timing, and several people in the gallery shifted with visible sympathy. He was very good at this. Cole watched him with the cold appreciation of a man who has studied a particular skill and can recognize excellence in it, regardless of how the skill is being used. When Pratt sat down, the county attorney, Ashby, a young man who had clearly not anticipated this morning going the way it was going, stood and asked Harlan 4 questions that Harlan answered with 4 smooth, gentle deflections. Ashby sat back down. Perrin looked ready to move to summation. Cole stood up. "Your Honor," he said, "the petitioner requests the opportunity to examine the respondent." Perrin looked at him over his spectacles with the expression of a man encountering an obstacle he had hoped to avoid. "Mr. Raines, you are not a licensed attorney. I am appearing as a material witness with direct knowledge of the events in question on behalf of the petitioner. I have that standing under Territorial Statute Section 14, Paragraph 3. A pause. Pratt was looking at Perrin with an expression that said the statute was real and challenging it would create a documented procedural problem. Perrin made a small gesture of concession. "You may proceed," he said in the tone of a man giving up a minor position in a contest he still considers decided. Cole walked to the front of the room and stood in front of Harlan Voss for a moment without speaking. Harlan met his gaze with the practiced equanimity of a man who had sat across from difficult people before and always emerged from the experience on the better side. "The wire used to restrain your wife on the night of January the 14th, Cole said. "What gauge was it?" A small pause. "I do not recall exactly." "Heavier than standard fence wire?" "I am not certain." The knots that secured her wrists to the post were tied from behind with her arms pulled back at an angle that made self-application physically impossible. Cole said it without inflection. "Who tied those knots?" "She was in considerable distress. It is possible she had become entangled during her episode." "In barbed wire, tied from behind, in 2 separate locations, each knotted independently." Cole let the silence after that sit for 3 full seconds. "The temperature that night was 14 degrees. She was wearing a cotton nightgown. Your 3 daughters were wrapped in dish towels. Is your testimony that you left that scene to go for help?" "I went for assistance, yes." "Where did you go?" "Into town." "And the judge's office where you filed the guardianship papers is in which direction from the east fence line of your property?" A longer pause this time. "South," Harlan said carefully. "The same direction as town?" "Yes." "So you went south to town to the judge's office to file legal papers?" Cole looked at him steadily. "Before you notified a doctor, before you sent anyone back to the fence line where your wife and 3 newborn daughters were in 14-degree weather, I acted in the order I believe best served the children's welfare." "You acted in the order that best served the legal position you intended to take the following morning," Cole said. "Those are different things." Pratt objected. Perrin sustained. Cole moved forward without pause. "Were you acquainted with a woman named Cora Dillard prior to her becoming your wife?" Something moved in Harlan's face. Controlled immediately. "My first wife, yes. She died in May of 1877, 11 months after your marriage. A loss I carry every day. Dr. Halsey signed her death certificate, cause of death listed as fever." "That is correct." "Was anyone else present in the house during her final illness?" Another pause, fractionally longer than the ones before it. A midwife attended her in the last days. I do not recall her name. Ruth Calloway, Cole said. He turned to the gallery. Ruth Calloway stood up from the third row. She was 61 years old, compact and gray-haired, with hands that were slightly bent from the arthritis that had ended her midwifery work years before. She had the expression of a person who had made a decision that frightened her and had decided that being frightened was not a sufficient reason not to honor it. She walked to the front of the room at Perrin's nod. "Mrs. Calloway," Cole said, "did you attend Cora Voss during her final illness in April and May of 1877? "I did." Her voice was steady, quiet, but steady. "Can you describe her condition when you first attended her?" "She had a cough. That was why I was called. But when I arrived, the cough was not the most significant thing I found." Ruth looked at Harlan Voss while she said the next part. She had bruising on her arms, on her ribs. Old bruising and new bruising together, which meant it had been occurring over a period of time. When I asked about the bruises, she said she had fallen. "She said it twice," Cole said. "Yes, the second time before I asked." "What did you do?" "Nothing." The word fell into the room like a stone into water. "I did nothing. I was afraid of what saying something would cost me in a town where Edgar Voss holds the mortgage on half the properties and funds the institutions and has done since before I arrived. I told myself I did not know enough to make a certain claim. I told myself it was not my place." Ruth paused. "I have spent 3 years explaining to myself why I kept quiet, and none of those explanations have held up well in the examining." The gallery was silent in the way galleries are only silent when something true has been said in them plainly enough to find every person in the room. "Mrs. Calloway," Cole said, "do you have anything in your possession relevant to this proceeding?" Ruth reached into the bag on her lap and removed a small book, dark brown leather worn at the corners from years of being kept and handled and kept again. "The week before Cora Voss died," Ruth said, "I was asked to leave the house while the doctor attended her privately. In the hallway near the door, I found this on the floor. It had fallen from a coat or a pocket. I did not know what to do with it. I took it home." She paused. "I have kept it for 3 years, trying to decide what to do with it. I have been afraid of what it meant that I had it. I have been more afraid in recent months of what it means that I had it, and stayed quiet." Pratt was on his feet immediately. Perrin raised a hand to quiet him and then leaned forward and said in a tone different from any he had used all morning, "May I see that?" It was not phrased as a question. Ruth walked forward and placed the book on the judge's bench. Perrin opened it. The room waited. Cole watched the judge's face with the attention he had once given to faces in interrogation rooms, looking for the specific moment when a person's understanding of a situation reorganized itself around new information. He saw it. A small movement at the corners of Perrin's eyes. A tightening. The face of a man who had walked into a room thinking he knew its dimensions and had just encountered a war where he had not known there was one. Perrin read for nearly 2 full minutes. Then he looked up at Pratt, then at Harlan, then at Edgar Voss in the front row. Edgar Voss, for what Cole suspected was a rare moment in a well-managed life, looked uncertain. Cole said quietly, "Your Honor, I would like to submit a document to the court." He carried the file to the bench and placed it in front of Perrin. Perrin opened it. The first page had Edgar Voss's name at the top and a date in 1862, and below that, in the faded but legible handwriting of the man, Cole Raines had been 16 years ago. A careful enumeration of land transactions, coercion records, and at the bottom of the page the notation, 3 structures burned. 2 families unaccounted for. Possible homicide. At the back of that file, Cole said, "You will find a letter. It arrived from the Federal Land Office in Washington 2 weeks ago, forwarded through Marshal Crawford's office in Cheyenne. It concerns 6 deaths in this county between 1861 and 1874, originally ruled accidental or attributed to illness, reopened for federal review following an inquiry submitted by Marshal Crawford." He turned and looked directly at Edgar Voss. Edgar Voss had the expression of a man watching something he had believed permanent beginning to show its first cracks. "Your Honor," Cole said, "I would like to call Wren Alcott to testify." Perrin, who had not looked up from the file, made a gesture of assent that came from somewhere more genuine than the mechanical rulings he had been issuing all morning. Wren walked to the front of the room. She stood at the witness position and looked at Harlan Voss across the room. He looked back at her. Whatever passed between them in that moment was private, and it lasted only a second before Wren turned her eyes to the room and began. She talked for a long time. She started at the beginning. The courtship, the man she had believed Harlan to be, the qualities she had seen in him or believed she was seeing or had been shown with such skill that the difference between shown and real had not been detectable to her at 20 years old. She did not apologize for having been deceived. She described it the way it was, a deception constructed by someone practiced in the construction of them, deployed against a person who had been given no reason not to trust what she was presented with. She talked about the first time, 3 months into the marriage. The incident that she had been told and had believed was a singular failure of an otherwise good man under unusual pressure. She talked about the apology, the flowers, the promise. She talked about how completely she had accepted the promise because she had needed to accept it, because the alternative to accepting it was a truth she had not yet accumulated enough knowledge of the world to know how to live with. She talked about the second time and the third and the shortening of the intervals between them until there were no intervals, only a continuous reality that she organized her days around managing. She talked about what that management cost, how it narrowed the available world, how it redirected energy that should have gone to other things toward the single constant project of anticipating and avoiding. She talked about what it did to a person's understanding of themselves, how the repeated experience of being told you were wrong, inadequate, the source of your own suffering, became over time not something you were told, but something you believed deeply and structurally, in the way you believe things that have been demonstrated to you consistently enough that they feel like facts about reality rather than lies about yourself. She talked about hoping when she became pregnant that this would change things. She talked about the specific quality of that hope, desperate and not fully convinced of itself, even as she maintained it, the hope of someone who has run out of other options. She talked about the night. She talked about it with the precision Cole had helped her find over 6 weeks of evenings, the precision of testimony rather than narrative, because testimony needed to be specific and chronological and resistant to the kind of vagueness that could be filled with alternative interpretations. The temperature, the wire, the positioning of her arms, the weight of the knots, the words Harlan had spoken before he walked away. Words she quoted directly without softening or paraphrase. The sound of the snow in the dark, the sound of 3 infants crying and the crying growing quieter. She talked about what she had thought in those hours. She said plainly that she had believed she was going to die, and that her daughters were going to die, and she said the hardest part of it, the part she had not been able to say until she had practiced it in the dark alone, which was that, in the last hours, she had begun to believe that Harlan might be right, that this was the correct end of a story she was in, that she had failed, and this was the result, and perhaps she had deserved it. She stopped. She looked at the 3 cedar plaques that Cole had brought from the cabin and placed on the petitioner's table that morning. Nora, Bess, Willa. "Then I heard a horse," she said, "and then a voice, and then I was not alone." The room was silent in the way it is only silent when something true has been said so plainly that it has no place to go except into the people hearing it. Harlan's lawyer cross-examined for 20 minutes with professional thoroughness, attacking her credibility from every available direction. Her living situation, the circumstantial quality of certain claims, the absence of other witnesses for specific events. He was competent, and he was not cruel for the pleasure of it, but because cruelty was the appropriate professional tool for the job he had been hired to do. Wren answered every question. She did not flinch, and she did not cry, and she did not raise her voice. She had had 6 weeks of practice, and she had 16 years of reason, and the combination of those 2 things was formidable in a way that Pratt had not fully anticipated, and that showed in the slight adjustment of his approach around question 9. When Pratt sat down, Judge Perrin looked at the small brown book still on his bench. He looked at the file. He looked at Harlan Voss with an expression that had changed substantially since the morning began. Marshal Holt Crawford stepped forward from the back wall. "Your Honor," Crawford said in the flat, authoritative register of federal jurisdiction, "I would like to submit documentation from the Federal Territorial Office in Cheyenne, entered into evidence under federal civil procedure." He laid a sealed envelope on the judge's bench. Perrin opened it. Inside were 2 death certificates, both signed by Dr. Halsey, one for Cora Voss, May 1877, one for Agnes Burrell, September 1874. A woman whose name appeared in the margin of Cole's file beside a property transaction, and 3 words: wife. Agnes. Unaccounted. Both deaths. Same physician. Same clinical language. Same conclusion. Behind the death certificates was a deposition from Dr. Halsey himself, taken in Cheyenne 4 days prior by Marshal Crawford, in which the physician, confronted with the federal documentation and the particular focused attention of 2 federal deputies in a small room, had provided a detailed and medically specific account of what Cora Voss's condition had actually indicated, what he had been paid to report instead, and by whom the payment had been made. Perrin set the documents down. He sat without speaking for a long moment. Then he said very quietly to his clerk, "Ask Deputy Simmons to step inside." He looked at Edgar Voss. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I am going to ask you not to leave this building." Edgar Voss looked at Pratt. Pratt, who was reading the documents on the bench with the expression of a man recalculating rapidly, gave the smallest possible shake of his head. Edgar Voss sat back. The gallery was cleared for a private conference that lasted 40 minutes and included Cole Crawford, Pratt Harlan, and the county attorney Ashby, who had been handed Crawford's documentation and given time to read it, and who emerged from that reading as a considerably more engaged participant in the proceedings than he had been at 9 o'clock that morning. When the gallery was readmitted, Perrin spoke for 12 minutes. He spoke about the evidence before the court. He spoke about the federal documentation. He spoke carefully and with visible discomfort about the court's previous reliance on certain medical certifications that the federal evidence called into serious and documented question. He found in favor of Wren Alcott, full and permanent custody of Nora Bess and Willa, awarded to their mother without condition. The guardianship order vacated. The competency claim dismissed with prejudice, which meant permanently. Harlan Voss, pending federal investigation into the deaths of Cora Voss and Agnes Burrell, remanded to the custody of Marshal Crawford, pending formal charges. Edgar Voss, pending the same federal investigation, restricted from leaving the territory. Harlan stood when Perrin finished. Not to speak or to protest, but the way a man stands when the floor has shifted beneath him and the body responds before the mind can direct it. Pratt put a hand on his arm. He sat back down. He looked across the room at Wren with an expression Cole watched carefully. It was not remorse. It was the expression of a man who had lost and did not yet know how to believe that losing was something that could happen to him, filing the experience away with the intention of revisiting it from a better position when circumstances changed. Crawford's deputies were already moving. Cole stood at the petitioner's table while the room reorganized itself around the noise and movement of aftermath. He picked up the 3 cedar plaques and held them under his arm. He looked at the tin box file now in the custody of the court. 16 years. He thought about May. Not about the manner of what had happened to her, not about what had been taken and by whose agency, but about what she had believed and how she had held it her particular quality of refusing to accept that the world had to be only as good as its worst examples. He thought it was a reasonable use of a Tuesday in January, standing in a courtroom in Redemption Falls, while justice, imperfect and slow and arrived at through considerable difficulty, did what it was occasionally capable of doing. He thought she would have agreed. Wren appeared beside him. She looked at the room, at Harlan being walked toward Crawford's deputies, at Edgar Voss sitting rigid in the front row with his hands on his knees and his face showing something it had perhaps never shown before in public. The look of a man at the end of what his money can arrange. At the people in the gallery, some of whom were recalibrating quietly, recalculating the story they had believed and what it meant that they had believed it. Is it done? She asked. The immediate part, Cole said. Crawford will have federal work ahead of him. That takes time. But what needed to happen today, yes, it is done. She was quiet. I kept waiting to feel something large, she said. Some enormous release. Does it not feel that way? She considered the question honestly. It feels like putting something down that I have been carrying so long I forgot what my hands felt like without it. She looked at him. Is that enough? That is exactly enough, Cole said. They walked out of the courtroom into the cold January air, and the town went about its ordinary business around them, horses and commerce and the smell of wood smoke and the specific normalcy of a place that would continue being itself regardless of what had just happened in the hall above the feed store, because places did that. Ada was waiting outside with the horses as she had said she would be. She looked at their faces and read them with the accuracy of a woman who had been reading faces for 68 years. She allowed herself for approximately 3 seconds an expression of complete and unconditional satisfaction. Then she handed Cole Roper's reins and said, The girls have been fed. Nora pulled Bess's blanket off twice and appeared extremely pleased about it both times. Cole took the reins. He looked at Wren. She was looking up at the ridge, at Crescent Ridge visible above the tree line in the clear winter air. He had noticed over 6 weeks that she looked at it often with the particular look of someone who has found a direction to orient by and is making use of it. He reached into his coat pocket and removed the 4 pieces of cedar on their leather cord. Nora, Bess, Willa, and below those 3 a 4th piece smaller with a single letter, W. He held the cord out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. I am not good with pretty words, Cole said. I never have been, but I am good at being where I said I would be. I am good at not leaving. He held the cord steady in the cold air between them. I stayed on that ridge for 16 years because I did not know what else to do with myself. I would like to stay for better reasons if you will have me. You and those girls. All 4 of you. He paused. That is the whole speech. I do not have more than that. Wren Alcott, 23 years old, who had been told in 100 different ways by one man what she was worth, and who had nearly died on a fence post in a January blizzard, half believing him, looked at Cole Raines for a long moment. Then she reached out and took the cedar cord from his hand and held it against her chest with both hands. Yes, she said. One word, said plainly without decoration. It was everything. Ada Briggs, standing 3 feet away, made a sound that she immediately converted into clearing her throat and turned to adjust something on her horse that did not require adjusting. They rode back up to Crescent Ridge in the late afternoon light, the 3 of them, the valley spreading out gold and white below them in the low winter sun. And the cabin waited at the top of the trail with smoke from the chimney, and 3 voices audible from 20 yards out. Nora's was the loudest. She had always been the loudest. Cole unsaddled the horses while Wren went inside, and through the cabin wall he heard the sound of reunion. Ada's voice and Wren's voice, and then the particular quality of quiet that happens when a mother gathers all 3 of her daughters at once, and the daughters who have been uncertain about the world for a day become suddenly certain again. He stood in the barn with his hand on Roper's flank and listened to it. Then he finished with the horses and went inside. The years went forward the way years do, without announcement or ceremony, accumulating into a life that bore almost no resemblance to the one Cole Raines had been maintaining on Crescent Ridge in January of 1879, and every possible resemblance to something he had stopped allowing himself to imagine. They married in the spring quietly, with Ada and Ruth Calloway, and Marshall Crawford and his wife present, and 3 infants in a wicker basket beside the fireplace. The man who performed the ceremony was a territorial judge Crawford had brought from Cheyenne because Cole felt the occasion warranted someone who owed nothing to anyone in this particular valley. The federal case against Edgar Voss took 2 years. Cole testified twice in Cheyenne, once about the original investigation and once about the events of January 1879. Crawford assembled a case that was careful and thorough and resulted in a finding that Cole had largely stopped expecting to see. Edgar Voss died in the territorial prison in 1884, 3 years into a sentence organized around the understanding that at the federal level, money has limits. It does not have at the county level. Harlan Voss received 25 years at the federal penitentiary at Laramie. He served 14 of them before dying of a condition the prison physician described as cardiac failure, which Cole thought contained more accuracy than the doctor probably intended. Nora grew up to be a doctor. This surprised no one who had observed her as an infant approach every challenge with the focused intensity of a person determined to solve it. She studied in Cheyenne and then in Philadelphia and returned west to practice in a territory that had more need of medicine than it had practitioners willing to provide it. She had her mother's stillness and her father's way of looking at something until he understood it, and her patients trusted her with a specific trust extended to someone who has clearly been somewhere difficult and come back from it with something useful. Bess became a lawyer who took cases that did not pay well because the people who needed them most generally could not pay otherwise. She had a quality of argument that Cole recognized immediately, the precise and patient quality of a person who understood what evidence was worth and how to make other people understand it too. She had her great-grandmother's name, and Cole privately believed something of that woman's quality of persistence, the willingness to stand in the right place and hold it against pressure. Willer taught school for 30 years, first in a one-room building outside Redemption Falls, and then in the proper schoolhouse the town eventually built when it grew large enough to require one. The children she taught included children of people who had been in that courtroom in January of 1879 and made their private calculations about which side of things to be seen standing on. She did not hold it against them. She was the most like May in the photographs Cole had kept in the tin box in the quality of her forgiveness, which was not naive or uninformed, but extended deliberately and with clear eyes, because she had decided that it was what a person did when they understood the full cost of its absence. Cole and Wren grew old on Crescent Ridge. They fixed the north wall of the barn in the spring of 1879 and the hinge on the smokehouse door the following fall, and over the years they fixed and built and expanded until Crescent Ridge bore little resemblance to the place Cole had maintained alone for 16 years. Except in the essential quality of it, the solidity of the log walls, the particular way the morning light came through the east window, the sound the ridge made at night when the wind came off the Laramie Range with its cold and its patience and its absolute indifference to the plans of human beings. They sat on the porch in the evenings when the weather allowed and watched the valley below change slowly, the town growing, new roads appearing, the world arranging itself into whatever came next with the forward indifference that the world has always had toward what came before. On an evening in October, 20 years after the night, Cole had heard 3 cries in a blizzard and turned his horse east toward them. They sat on that porch and watched their grandchildren run through the yard below the cabin. Nora's 2 and Bess's 1 and Willa's 3, the latter group being loud in the specific way that Willa's children were always loud, which was to say cheerfully and without apparent intention of stopping. Cole watched them and thought about a night in January and a fence post and wire and 3 cedar plaques and a thin wooden spoon worn smooth from a previous grief repurposed into something that sustained life. He thought about the things a man saved without knowing what he was saving them for, and the moment when the purpose became clear. He thought about May, not with the old weight of unfinished business, not with the grief and anger so long entangled he had stopped distinguishing between them, with something quieter. The understanding that the best use of what she had meant to him was not to keep it sealed in a tin box under a floorboard, but to let it be part of what he built, to let it inform what he became and how he chose to spend the years that remained to him after she was gone. He thought she would have agreed with that. Wren put her hand over his on the arm of the chair. They sat like that, watching the children run, and the light came off the ridge the way it comes in October, long and gold and particular, the kind of light that makes even ordinary things look like what they actually are, which is not ordinary at all. May would have loved all this noise, Cole said. Wren's hand tightened on his. She would be proud of you, Cole Raines, she said. He looked at their grandchildren in the fading light. He looked at the cabin behind them, solid and permanent, built to last. He thought about what it meant to stay when staying was the harder choice, to turn towards something rather than away from it, to let yourself be responsible for people in a world that could take them. He thought it meant everything. The children ran on in the last of the October light. The ridge held them the way good things hold the people who build them. Not because the world arranges itself kindly around human effort, and not because loss stops being real, and not because the math of grief ever fully resolves, but because some people in the specific moment when it matters most decide to stay. And then they do.